he's been with a long time.
Well, good evening, everyone. I also want to welcome you all to the Holland Land Office Museum for our guest speaker series here in 2026. I see a lot of familiar faces from last night, so back-to-back features going on here. So thank you for spending another night with us. This program has been going on for 9 years now, and it has grown substantially. So now we're drawing presenters from actually around the United States to come and speak here. So very excited about that. I wanted to thank Tompkins Community Bank and Batavia Rotary Club for helping to sponsor the guest speaker and concert series, as well as GoArt. We received a grant through the Regrant Program. So I'll just read this quick statement. I would like to acknowledge GoArt's support of this project. GoArt recognizes that this gathering takes place on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and acknowledges their enduring presence in this region. So now I will ask Carl from the Buffalo Civil War Roundtable to come up to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Carl Monica. I'm from the Buffalo Civil War Roundtable. I'm sort of in charge of scheduling. There's a certain title involved with that. Well, you can skip that. How many people, I just want to ask one question. How many people have heard, put it mildly, Buffalo Civil War Roundtable, at least? We do have a Facebook, terrific. I know we have some members there. And that's accomplishing my goal tonight. It's a very interesting program tonight. Our number one speaker happens to be here, at least in my opinion, and maybe many of you as well. But we're going to be on a different topic other than Abe or Mr. Grant or Mr. Lee or somebody. So I'm very interested myself in hearing what he has to say, and I want to welcome Dr. Chris Mackowski, and as I always like to say this time of the year, go Yankees. Dr. Mackowski.
I'll be honest, I'm thinking of seeing your sweatshirt, I'm thinking of Bill Bonus, So I teach out at St. Bonaventure, so I had class this morning, my voice is a little hoarse, so
And go Bills.
and go Bills, of course, go Bills. Right? And it's great, like, I live in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and there's like this great Bills expatriate community that lives down there. So like, I'll be walking through Wegmans, because of course, Wegmans, right? And like there'll be someone with a Bills thing, and I'm like, go Bills, and it's just like the cult, call and answer. It's wonderful, because I don't feel so alone down there in Dixie. So it's a real treat to be able to come here tonight, and I've got to give props to Ryan, because he's always like, Chris, could you come and speak? And I always say yes, because my daughter lives 25 minutes down the road, and like my granddaughter, my oldest granddaughter turns 6 next weekend, and I've got a 2-year-old, so like I want to come see the grandbaby, so like he asked me to come, I'm like yes, but then the poor guy has to wrangle me because I have a terrible schedule, things get a lot, and like he's the most patient man in the entire world, and I'm grateful to him because I always love to come here, and it's always like getting to hang out with a very friendly crowd, and so I appreciate always the chance to be here, and I appreciate Ryan's efforts and the work that he does in this gem of a museum, so it's always a privilege to be here, and I get to go see my grandbabies too. John Adams is a little different for me. As Carl mentioned, I'm generally known as a Civil War guy, but I've got a huge man crush on John Adams, and I've had it for like a quarter of a century, I just have to admit. I first met Adams in 2000 when Joseph J. Ellis published his book, Founding Brothers, won the Pulitzer Prize for History that year. And has anybody read that book, Founding Brothers? The rest of you go read it. 2 of you have read it. Now you have homework. That's what I do. I'm a professor. I give you homework, right? Go read it. The thing that is genius about that book is it recasts the Founding Fathers as brothers. Now why is that important? Well, I'm going to quote the great rock and roll sage Keith Richards. Someone once asked him, like, why do you and Mick fight all the time? And he says, it's because we're brothers, mate. We're not just friends, we're brothers, and brothers fight. Yes, of course, that's what brothers do. They squabble all the time. Mom, he's on my side of the seat, back, he's touching me. Like, that's what brothers do from the time they start, right? But they're always there for each other. And so casting the Founding Fathers as a bunch of squabbling siblings illuminated them and their relationships and the founding itself by putting them into those moments of tension where the siblings are squabbling. And I just thought that was a brilliant way to take these guys off their pedestals and show them to us in a way that's human. The other services he does is of his 8 main characters. There are actually only 7 founding fathers. The 8th is Abigail, a founding mother. And I'm a person who thinks you cannot say enough positive things about Abigail Adams and how crucial she is to the American founding. He also really reminds us that Ben Franklin is a founding grandfather. You know, he's a generation older than everybody else. And so that has some interesting dynamics to it too. But the best part about the book is he's kind of showing us the humanity of these people. John Adams just stood out to me because you can see the founders posing for history. Wearing my buckle shoes and my fancy socks. And Adams is just like, but no, I gotta tell you this. And he just can't hold the pose, Ellis says. And I just found that remarkably interesting, attractive, and fascinating. And one of the things Ellis says about Adams is that for him, the most meaningful form of conversation is an argument. And that's not because he was argumentative for the sake of being contentious or disputatious. He's a lawyer. And what do lawyers do? They argue. They build a case, they create an argument, they present facts, context, structure. And so by engaging in an argument, it was a way to test out that structure. Having an opinion is not enough. And so he was enlivened by that process of argument. And so as I decided I wanted to tackle writing about John Adams myself, who's been written about a lot. We tend to think of him as a forgotten founder, but there's a lot written about this man. What else can I bring to that conversation? And I thought about this idea of argument, of squabbling, of contentiousness, of relationship. And so what I tried to do when I wrote about Adams was looked at his different key relationships at different points of the Revolution. And how could that squabbling, how could that argument shed light on those moments of the Revolution? How could they shed light on Adams? And so that's what I'd like to talk about tonight and kind of walk you through some of those key relationships. This is the 3rd time I've given this talk. I'm going to have you here for an hour and 5 minutes. If you get tired, feel free to nap. Or you can sit in the barber chair up here. That'd be fun too. Or if I start talking about someone you don't like Thomas Paine, go get a cup of coffee. I won't be bothered. Okay? Now, I'll also admit right up front, there's going to be a point where they're going to sign the Declaration of Independence. I don't want to spoil things for you, but they do sign it. Okay? And then it's going to feel like, oh, hooray, we're done. And no, we're going to have 10 more minutes, okay? Because the revolution doesn't end on July 4th, 1776. And we forget that it goes all the way to 1782. I will not walk us through that in real time, I promise. But there are important things that happen that Adams plays an important role in that we can understand by looking at some of these relationships. So I want to start our narrative atop Munjoy Hill in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Today what we would know as Portland, Maine. It's a morning in August 1774, and John Adams is standing atop Munjoy Hill with his old friend Jonathan Sewell, 172 feet above Portland Harbor, and the archipelago of Casco Bay spread out before them, ships and boats moving back and forth between the islands. It's a beautiful morning. John writes about it quite eloquently. He's a wonderful writer, but he's most lively as a writer when he's writing about the natural world. But there's a chill on this particular morning, even though it's August. But it's not because of the weather. It's because of the gulf between these two men. Sewell is 7 years Adams' senior, But they grew up together in Boston's legal community as young lawyers. And they had once been so close that Jonathan called John brother. Indeed, he once said, Adams has a heart formed for friendship. It's one of the reasons I like him so much. But this gulf that has opened between them because of the politics in Massachusetts has created this chill that Adams writes, 11 years ago, I thought him the best friend I had in the world. And I loved him accordingly. But at this moment, I look upon him as the most bitter, malicious, determined, and implacable enemy I have. God forgive him for the part he has acted, both in public and private life. And then he adds the most Adams-like insight to the end of that. He says, it is not impossible that he may say the same prayer for me. These men who had been close enough to be brothers, as I mentioned, had started to establish their legal practices in Boston in the late 1950s together. They ran in the same circles, they had the same friends, they had the same mentors. They even wooed sisters together. Jonathan wooing Esther Quincy, whom he would later marry. John wooing Hannah Quincy, who he would not. Because as it happened, the day that John decides he's going to propose, he sits down with Hannah and he's about to pop the question, and in bustle Jonathan and Esther, and they break the moment. But he's never able to recapture the mood. He's never able to propose. And a year later, Hannah's engaged to someone else. John later says that Jonathan actually rescued him from a certain acceptance and certain marriage that would have sentenced him to a life in which he was not yet able to financially support himself. That's good for us because it would allow Adams a little while later to meet Abigail Smith, whom we'll talk about in just a minute. As these two men really kind of bond and hang out and form this important relationship, politics in Boston grow increasingly tumultuous because of British taxes and assaults on writs of assistance, which impact Bostonians' liberties. We've got things that are so intolerable, they're called the Intolerable Acts. Eventually, the British will start quartering troops in Boston homes. And each of these events makes the situation in Boston more and more tumultuous. And Adams and Sewall find themselves on opposite sides of the growing political divide. This is particularly so for Sewall because he becomes Attorney General for the colony, a pretty important position attached to the crown. Adams, meanwhile, as an attorney, finds himself defending clients such as John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant who's actually from John's hometown in Quincy, whose ship gets seized, and Hancock is accused of smuggling. And Sewall prosecutes the case, and Adams defends him so successfully that Sewall has to drop the charges. Sewall and Adams find themselves sparring in newspaper columns that they're writing under pseudonyms. But despite this growing professional tension, they try to keep their friendship alive. One night, Sewall even stops by Adams's house in his little apartment that he has in Boston for dinner, and he surprises John with an offer from the colonial governor to become the judge or the advocate general for the Court of the Admiralty, a highly influential and connected position that would put John in touch with the most important commerce in the colony. He'd be a made man. John says he's got to think about it. He actually makes up his mind pretty quickly, but he doesn't want to hurt his friend's feelings. And Sewall gives him some time to think about it, and weeks go by, and months go by, and Sewall's like, what do you think? What are you thinking? Eventually, John finally has to say, I cannot accept a position that would put my personal interests at such antipodes with my professional obligations. Take a about it, change your mind, and let me know. But this really starts that professional rift between them. And they'll continue sparring on opposite sides of this growing debate until finally Adams and Sewell have this rupture that makes them think they are implacable, bitterest enemies. But they come together on this August morning in 1774 at Sewell's invitation. The two of them are riding the circuit. Sewell prosecuting things for the Crown. Adams is representing private clients. They have come up to Falmouth. And Sewell has heard that John has been selected as part of a delegation to go to a proposed Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And Sewell doesn't want his friend to go. You'll be on the wrong side of history, Sewell says. You'll be branded a traitor. But John tells him, I have crossed the Rubicon. Live or die, sink or swim, survive or perish with my country, that is my unalterable determination. We don't know how their full conversation goes. We do know we have two of the best attorneys in the colony at the peak of their powers, confident in their ability to persuade, trying to persuade someone they know is unpersuadable. We don't know if tempers got heated. We don't know if someone stormed off and went back to their lodging. We don't know if perhaps they walked sullenly in silence back to their lodging house together. But we do know Adams says afterwards, I fear we must part, and I say, with a bleeding heart, I fear forever. But you may depend on it. This is the sharpest thorn I have ever set my foot upon. It'll only be months later when violence breaks out in Lexington and Concord, and a colonial army will converge around Boston besieging British troops. Sewell's house is in Cambridge. He'll have to evacuate with his family to go into Boston behind the safety of British lines. Eventually he'll relocate to Halifax and then go live in exile in London, where the British aren't all that happy with anybody who helped them lose their colonies. So he doesn't live out a very happy life. Adams will only see him one more time. And that's when he's the minister of the court, the minister to the court of St. James, the first ambassador to King George III from the United States. He turns out on the right side of history, as it happens. And he goes to see his old friend. And it's not a nanny boo-boo, rub your nose in it kind of thing. He wants to see his old friend and how he's holding up. And they have what they both describe as a wonderful, warm 3 or 4 hour meeting. But afterwards, John is pretty upset at the poor state that Jonathan's living in. And he will ever after consider his dear old friend to be one of the casualties of the Revolution. Now, Adams does go off to Philadelphia as part of that 4-man delegation, along with Robert Treat Paine, Thomas Cushing, and his cousin Sam, whom we all know is one of the great brewers of all time. Sam is 12 years older than his cousin John. His family's from Boston. He was actually born there. So the two are separated by age and geography. They're not especially close. They share a great-grandfather, James Adams. But Sam is a great cultivator of talent. And when John sets up his law practice in Boston, Sam sees him as someone to keep an eye on. It'll be good to have someone who's known for his integrity and his independence. He doesn't bring John into the inner circles of the Sons of Liberty, because it's important to have that outside person working in the system. The Sons of Liberty are basically the population that rises up in protest to these British taxes. And Sam is one of the ringleaders. He's the one who organized protests around the Liberty Tree on the edge of Boston Commons. He'll be the one who will create these committees of correspondence that connect Boston with other towns throughout Massachusetts, and eventually Massachusetts with other colonies known as committees of correspondence. He may have had a role in rousing up the crowd in March of 1770 that assaults British troops outside the Boston Custom House. We do know he certainly plays a role in playing that up as the Boston Massacre, because he understands the propaganda value of such a sensationalist title. The British call it the incident on King Street. Boston Massacre, oh yeah. One of the talents that he cultivates is a young silversmith named Paul Revere, who engraves that, whose printing shop helps spread the propaganda, helps with these committees of correspondence. Sam may have had a role in the Boston Tea Party, rousing up that crowd. I say may, because one of Sam's amazing superpowers is the ability to cultivate culpable deniability. His fingers are pulling the strings, and yet he leaves his fingerprints nowhere. John writes a wonderful story about the two of them sharing their boarding house in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress, and Sam is throwing packets of letters into the fire. And in the summertime, he'll sit next to the window and cut up letters with scissors into pieces as small as atoms, A-T-O-M-S, that can never be reassembled. And he throws them out the window. And John says, "Why are you doing this?" And Sam says, "Whatever may become of me, my friends shall not be harmed because of my negligence." He's got this secret network. So as they ride into Philadelphia for that first Continental Congress, they stop just outside the city the night before Congress is to convene. They're in New Jersey. Poor guys. And part of the delegation from Philadelphia rides out to meet him. Members of the delegation who are also Sons of Liberty. And they say, "Listen, there's been a letter writing campaign about you guys. You are fire-breathing radicals. We're here to preach independence." And the guys from Philadelphia say, "Whatever you do, do not mention independence. It is as unpopular here as the British taxes themselves." So the next day, Congress convenes. The first person to stand up is Sam Adams, and everyone's expecting a fire-branded stemliner of a speech. And instead, he calls for a prayer. It immediately changes the tone and tenor of the deliberations. The thing that's most important about this relationship is the political education John gets from Sam. And it is not a relationship that has any sort of friction. Now later on in life, way later on in life, Sam will be much more Jeffersonian than John Adamsian. But John respects his cousin so much that he doesn't begrudge the fact that Sam is known as the famous Mr. Adams. Oh my, the less famous Mr. Adams, right? And this is incredible because if you read John's correspondence, one of the central tensions throughout his whole life is his vanity. He says it is his cardinal vice. And he fights with it constantly. He knows it's a vice. And he's trying all the time to get his arms around it and pat it down. So there's this battle between his need for recognition and fame and his desire for humility. It's fascinating. He has a huge ego, and yet he is never threatened by Sam. And I think that's a testament to the regard in which he held his cousin. In fact, John later says, "Without the character of Sam Adams, the true story of American independence could never be written." That's a pretty big statement from a man who played such a key role in that story of independence. Now, when Congress gets going, of course, Adams meets lots of different folks. Someone who makes a pretty important impression on him is a guy named John Dickinson. Dickinson is an attorney from Dover, Delaware, which at that point is still part of Pennsylvania. It's funny because once the colonies decide to declare their independence from Britain, Delaware decides to declare its independence from Pennsylvania. So that's where that all comes together. Dickinson is best known for a series of newspaper articles that get assembled into a pamphlet known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. which becomes so popular it's the best-selling pamphlet in the colonies up to that point. And the basic premise is that British taxes are unfair and our liberties are being compromised. But he writes it in the voice of this homespun, down-to-earth farmer. Okay? Dickinson's hardly anything but a little homespun farmer. He comes from a fairly big plantation, slave-owning plantation outside of Dover. He sets up his law practice in Philadelphia, where he marries into one of the most influential families in the city and becomes instantly rich overnight. And that's what gets him into the political scene. And when John first meets him, because of course Dickinson's, because of the pamphlet, one of the most famous men in the colonies, and when John meets him, he is surprised, because he says, he is a shadow, tall but slender as a reed, pale as ashes. One would think at first sight that he could not live a month. But he has an excellent heart. The cause of his country lies near him. And he respects Dickinson for his commitment to liberty. But when Congress reconvenes for the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, Dickinson takes on a much more conservative air than he had had the previous fall. And as John and the fellow New Englanders are getting a little bit more bellicose about British interventionism, Dickinson is trying to hope for reconciliation. And he says, you New Englanders, if you keep up with these shouts of belligerence, you will have blood on your heads. But for Adams, there's already been blood spilled. Blood spilled on Lexington Green and near the North Bridge in Concord and along the Battle Road back to Boston. As John says, the weapons of war have changed from sword to pen. There is already blood. And he says that the war itself is now a war. That the colonies have now passed the Rubicon. Before it was his own personal commitment, but now they have reached a point of no return because of the spillage of blood. At one point he gives a very aggressive speech on the floor of the Congress, and shortly afterwards he has to excuse himself, and Dickinson gets up from his seat, storms after him in the most aggressive and haughty manner. And out in the hallway, Dickinson wrangles Adams as though Dickinson were the schoolmaster and I was the schoolboy. And Dickinson says, if you New Englanders continue to oppose our Pacific systems, I and others will break away from you and carry on the resistance in our own way. Adams keeps his cool, but he says, I will not be threatened. One thing that helps bring the temperature down is the army that's around Boston writes to the Congress and says they need help. They need supplies, they need reinforcements, they need leadership, they need guidance. And Congress votes to adopt the army, making it literally the Continental Army. It's the birth of the United States Army. And because the Congress is doing something to address the situation around Boston, the New Englanders back off a little bit and allow the conservatives to then issue what becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition. A letter that they send off to King George, kissing his butt, saying, we're sorry, can we get back together? I promise we didn't bring it. Maybe I had a little too much to drink. I don't know. King George doesn't even read the petition. Doesn't even accept the petition. And instead, he declares the colonies to be an open rebellion. Adams has the opportunity to say, I told you so here, but he doesn't. But he is venting to his friends in correspondence. And in one letter, he talks about the piddling genius whose fame has been trumpeted so loudly, who's given a silly cast to our whole doings. He's talking about Dickinson. Well, that letter gets intercepted by the British and published in a newspaper in Boston. And word of that finally makes its way to Philadelphia. And one day Adams is walking down the street in one direction, Dickinson's coming in the other. Adams bows, takes off his hat, and Dickinson walks haughtily by. It's a word Adams uses a lot when he describes Dickinson, haughty. And Adams said, I was determined to make my bow to get his mood. It appears we shall not be on bowing terms or speaking terms for the time. They would remain cordial during Florida Day of Congress, but the friendship that had once existed between them is gone from them. Dickinson's a person I've grown to admire working on this book. He's the voice of the opposition, but he's so principled in what he's doing that even Adams admires him. And as we'll see, he's kind of going to end up on the wrong side of this story and still manages to hold to his principles and duties. So as Adams is in Philadelphia through 1774, into 75, into 76, he's writing letters to his political correspondents back in Boston. But the most important correspondent he has is his wife Abigail, who's still tending the farm back in Quincy. I should also mention, since it just happened to occur to me as I pulled in, Quincy, Massachusetts is the home of Dunkin' Donuts, which is across the street. And Abigail, she was eager for him to take this job. She says, I long for you to take your position on the national stage. He's an attorney. She's used to him being away for a couple weeks at a time as he's riding the circuit. So, a couple weeks, a couple months off in Philadelphia. Go ahead. Little does she know, and she agrees to that their separations will be measured in years, not months or weeks. A quarter of their married life, more than a quarter of their married life, will be spent apart. That's to our good fortune, as stressful as it was on the two of them, because it's because they are apart that they're writing letters. We get to read their mail. They wrote some 1,100 letters between the two of them. And Abigail is a wonderful writer. She's chatty, she's newsy, she's very evocative. John's a little more close to the vest. He's afraid his letters are going to intercept it, as we've already seen is actually happening. The two of them met when John was 24 and Abigail was 14. And at first John didn't have a very good impression of Abigail. Thought she was maybe a little too talkative and a little too frank. But that's when he's wooing Hannah Quincy, so his eyes are full of those stars. After that calms down, he has the chance a couple of years later to meet her again, and his impression is entirely different. He describes her company as a constant feast. Tender feeling, sensible, friendly, a friend. Not an imprudent, not an indelicate, not a disagreeable word or action. Prudent, modest, delicate, soft, sensible, obliging, active. He is wow. We don't know what her impression is. It's lost to history, but we do know they start spending an awful lot of time together. And they're going to have a 2-year courtship before they finally marry. He is wowed by her because she is so smart. She's not formally educated, but her father is a minister who encourages her to read widely, teaches her French. And so she's just got this lively, well-informed mind. And John is in love with it. It doesn't hurt that she's also very pretty, but it's really her mind that he falls in love with. And she, for her part, finds him attractive because he values her mind at a time when men didn't typically value that in women. And that becomes the foundation for one of the most important marriages in American history because they treat each other as intellectual equals. And everything throughout John's career, he asks Abigail's opinion on. When he's vice president, he literally says, I can do nothing without you. And so that's the other reason that makes their correspondence so fascinating to read, because they're hashing out all of these things that John's trying to hash out in Congress. She's his sounding board, and she has excellent political radar. Her instincts are fantastic. Their marriage produces 6 children. They have 2 daughters who die in infancy. John tries to parent from away. It's difficult, and he says, like, this is the time kids need their dad, and I'm not there. And he agonizes over it. He agonizes over his separation from his dearest friend. And you can see this tension in their correspondence as he wrestles with it. He gets sick over and over, suffering from the stress of the separation. And yet he stays away. And she lets him. At any point, I'm convinced Abigail could have just written to him and said, enough, come home. And he would have. And he'd have been miserable. And she knows this about him. And so she lets him be away, the call of duty. And that's another one of these tensions in his life, that call for service, for duty, versus the call to be home and his duty there, and the tug of war that happens. And it's all tied up into that need for recognition. She lets him be John Adams. And she characterizes that sacrifice as her national service. And I think rightly so, because of what she has to give up and what she has to do so that he can go be John Adams. We're lucky that she let him go do it. I'd like to share with you just one of their letters. It's their most famous bit of correspondence. You've probably heard of this. It was written on a letter of March 31st, 1776. This is Abigail. In the code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. And be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit no dispute, she told him, urging him instead to willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. And he responds, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We've been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were growing disconcerted. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our full power in its full latitude. We're obliged to go fair and softly. And in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters. And rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. And some historians have criticized John for what could seem like a patronizing response and the dismissiveness. But I think to do that fails to look at the letter in the context of their full correspondence. And it fails to look at their full relationship. Again, understanding that they treat each other as equals. And they're used to banter. And they're used to, as he says, sauciness. And I love that about their letters. Like, there's a sexual tension between the two of them in their letters. He writes at one point, she makes some crack about his age when he's 60, and he says, oh, 60? If I were home, I'd show you I was not more than a man of 40. It's just wondering, And so like there's just that liveliness to their correspondence that if you just judge the letter, like, you know, but that fuller sense of who they were as a couple is important. So she responds, I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things that are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at your feet. Okay? So she writes back, still bantering, but she's still serious. She's kidding on the square here, right? Like, I'm going to still tell you. And then listen to his response. He lets her have the last word. Among all the disappointments and perplexities which have fallen to my share in life, nothing has contributed so much to support my mind as the choice blessing of a wife, whose capacity enabled her to comprehend and whose pure virtue obliged her to approve the views of her husband. This has been the cheering consolation of my heart in my most solitary, gloomy, and disconsolate hours. In this remote situation, I'm deprived in a great measure of this comfort. Yet I read, and I read again your charming letters, and they serve me in some faint degree as a substitute for the company and conversation of the writer. He knows who's the boss. She does too. And that's what makes their correspondence so lovely and wonderful. And I urge you to go find it for yourselves and read it. It's all available, and they're a wonderful company. John said to her, shortly after they married, I must entreat you, my dear partner, in all the joys and sorrows, prosperity and adversity of my life, to take part with me in the struggle. And she commits to that idea. So the laws that she's talking about in that letter, by this point, it's May, well, it starts March, April, May of 1776. And Congress is trying to decide, what's the next step? Things are moving at a pretty high speed at that point. And John has been thinking about these laws. This is, see, I never use PowerPoint, so I forget, like, here's Abigail Adams. Okay? Now we will move on to Thomas Paine. Right? So they're thinking about these laws and systems. And John's been thinking about this anyway, because as they're thinking, like, if we declare independence, what's that going to look like? And by May, John convinces the Congress to pass a resolution asking each colony to establish a new government of its own, independent of the crown. And he says this is basically a de facto declaration of independence, because as soon as the people create their own governments, there's no giving that power up. Well, then the question is, well, what do those governments look like? And so delegates are asking John, what should we do? What should this look like? And he's been thinking about this, and he starts writing letters to answer this question. He's had to do some writing on this topic for the Massachusetts General Court, and he also has been thinking about this because of Thomas Paine. Paine's 37 years old when he shows up in Philadelphia. He's recently emigrated from England. He's not had a particularly successful life. Immediately gets a job writing for some newspapers, starts writing a lot of political tracts, and that's what gets him into the political scene. And in January of 1776, he publishes a pamphlet called Common Sense, which becomes wildly successful, outsells Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer tenfold. And the reason it's so successful is because as all of these delegates are talking about independence and should we do this or that, the politicians are doing their politician thing in hoity-toity political legal language. They're writing, as one historian says, for the courthouse, whereas Paine's writing for the public house. Two guys sitting over beers talking about this, right? And people are like, well, yes, of course. And Paine lays out his argument so clearly. Like he says, how long is it possible for a continent to be ruled by an island? And people are like, yeah, right, yeah, you know? And so like, people get fired up, and it has a huge impact on turning public opinion in favor of independence. Congress is a little slower to react. Okay? And when John finds Common Sense, he's on his way back to Philadelphia from his Christmas break. He reads it at a bookshop in New York. He calls Paine a phenomenon. Buys some copies, sends some to Abigail and to some other friends. He says, it's ideas of independence I like very much. But the more time he spends with Common Sense, the more problematic he finds it. We tend to think of Common Sense today when we remember it as this great propaganda piece in favor of independence. But actually the whole second half of it is about what the new government should look like. But Paine is not a political theorist. He does not have experience in government. It's sort of like the armchair quarterback telling the Hall of Famer, here's what you ought to be doing. And Adams is so worried about the impact that such a popular pamphlet will have on the public imagination that he makes it his express mission to contradict or counteract Common Sense. And the result is a pamphlet that comes from writing some letters to fellow delegates who are saying, what should this new government look like? And he's been writing his answer out. And finally, he writes one of these out to Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who's like, this is fabulous, can I print it? And I was like, sure. They print it anonymously because it's treason, you know, so. But it's a pretty open secret that Adams wrote it. And you might not be familiar with Thoughts on Government, but I'm sure you're familiar with what's in it. 3 co-equal branches of government, including an executive with departments charged with carrying out the laws. Laws that are made by a legislature that's consisting of 2 houses, a large House of Representatives and a smaller, more select house that will serve as counterbalances to each other, and an independent judiciary. Sound familiar?
At least to some.
Yeah, at least to some. Yeah, I wish a few more people knew about that. And we tend to think of James Madison as the father of the Constitution, but what Madison puts forward in Philadelphia in 1787 doesn't really look a whole lot like the final product, which looks much more like what Adams lays out in Thoughts on Government. In fact, 8 of the colonies will create new governments that look like what Adams lays out, including Virginia, whose constitution is written by George Mason, who has a huge impact on how things turn out in 1787. And so Adams writes just a huge, huge volume of stuff over his life, and nothing will ever be as impactful or as important as Thoughts on Government. Ironically, one of the colonies that doesn't do a new constitution is Massachusetts. They're all still kind of torches and pitchforks angry over there. So a couple of years later, John will be asked to write their constitution, which he'll write in his front living room in the course of a couple of weeks. And it's passed almost unchanged. And it's the oldest existing constitution still in use in America today. Okay? And you might think, well, what about George Mason's, whatever? Reconstruction. All those Confederate constitutions had to get redone. So that's why some of those older constitutions are no longer in operation. So things are moving at a breakneck pace at this point. If we're going to talk about these relationships and these tensions and these arguments, this is where we have to bring in Thomas Jefferson, who shows up in our story just in time to become immortal. He was at the beginning of the Second Continental Congress, didn't really want to be there, but he had written some very influential tracts that his pen earns him a place in the delegation. But he leaves by August of 1775. His wife Martha is in poor health. He wants to be back in Charlottesville. He shows back up in mid-April. Doesn't want to be there. He wants to be in Williamsburg, where they're going to start doing a new constitution for Virginia. That's where the action is. But they're like, no, we need you to put it out here. Now, when they first met, Adams recalled that Jefferson said no more than 3 sentences at a time during congressional debate. He was silent. but it was in committees and in conversation where Jefferson's intellect really came forward. And Adams sees in Jefferson a kindred spirit, and they really kind of hit it off and become friends. Well, as the independence movement picks up steam, colonies are now setting up independent governments of their own, and at the beginning of July, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia calls the question, we should declare independence. Adams seconds it. He lets Lee bring the motion to the floor because Virginia, being the biggest, most powerful, wealthiest colony, should look like it's at the head of things. Okay? They debate it, and they can't come to any consensus, and so they table the motion. Dickinson is like, yes, it's tabled. Okay? But they only table it so that delegates can then write home and say, well, what do you want us to do? And get instructions. Well, Dickinson's hoping that we can just kill this by time. But Congress decides, well, let's not waste the time. Let's put together a committee that can write up a declaration of our grievances so that if we decide that we do want to declare independence, we've got something we can look at. And so Congress appoints a 5-person committee chaired by Adams that also includes Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, he's a cobbler who's gotten into politics, and Robert Livingston of New York, who's actually one of the conservatives who's put on the committee as a concession to the conservatives. And at first everyone looks at Franklin. I mean, he's the most famous man in America, Poor Richard's Almanac, he's been writing forever, but he writes these cute little clever aphorisms, and he has resolved to never write anything that will be edited by committee. So he says no. So then Adams and Jefferson look at each other, and Adams is like, all right, you need to do it. And Jefferson says, no, not me. And I think really Jefferson's sort of like, no, not me, not me, no, not me. And Jefferson says, well, you should do it. And Adams says, no, and I have 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and it should be a Virginian who's at the head of things. Where have we heard that, right? He also says, I'm obnoxious and disliked, and anything I write, people are just going to vote against as a knee-jerk reaction. Now, he doesn't actually say that, but the musical 1776 has us believe that. There's nobody who is in Congress at the time who describes Adams as obnoxious. Adams is the only person who describes himself, and he does that years later as he's writing his memoirs about this time. But he is a polarizing figure. And he also says to Jefferson, you're 10 times the writer than I am, which may or may not be false modesty. If you hear Jefferson's side of the story, he says, we got together as a committee. They said, Jefferson, you do it. I said, okay. And then he goes off to his apartment on Market Street and he writes the Declaration of Independence. It takes him about 3 weeks. We know that he comes back on June 28th with his draft. He does get Adams and Franklin together to go over the draft together, which they copy it and make some changes. The beginning of the Declaration, which talks about we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Adams is the one who inserts that phrase about our Creator. We see his handwriting in the original draft. Congress needs a couple days to settle down with business, and then on July 1st, they're supposed to take up the original motion again. It is a stormy-looking morning on July 1st, but Adams is seeing clear skies. He writes to a friend of his in Georgia that this morning is a sign for the greatest debate of all, a declaration that these colonies are free and independent states. They've been talking about this for months. It's no secret. He's expecting to go in there. They're going to pass this. It's feeling good. Congress gavels itself into session, takes care of a couple bits of business, and then organizes itself into a committee of the whole to debate the resolution. And the first person to stand up is John Dickinson. And he says, my conduct this day, I expect, will give the finishing blow to my once great and now too diminished reputation. And he launches into a 2-hour argument against independence, summing up everything that the conservatives have talked about over the previous months. It's a brilliant speech, the notes of which still exist today. We don't have a transcript of the full speech, but we have his notes. It's such a good speech that even Adams is impressed. And when Dickinson is finished, he sits down and it has taken a physical toll on him. He looks exhausted and ghastly. And even as he does, the thunderstorms that have been gathering outside begin to rumble, and lightning begins to flash, and rain begins to patter against the tall windows of Independence Hall. And yes, that sounds like a novelist made that up, but it's true. And Adams looks around, waiting for someone to rise to the moment to rebut Dickinson's argument. And no one does. And he's hoping that someone who's less obnoxious will rise to meet the moment. I think it's false modesty on his point. He's been the leading voice of independence for months. Everyone's waiting for him to get up. And he finally does. And for 4 hours, extemporaneously, he lays out the argument for independence. Now, one reason it lasts so long is because partway through, the New Jersey delegation comes in and says, "What did you say? Could you repeat that?" And he does. We don't have a transcript of the speech. We don't have notes. But we have reactions from delegates who talk about Adams' eloquence. It's a word that comes up a lot. One person says he's even beyond eloquence. Jefferson says that Adams spoke with such a force of ideas that we rose from our seats. He is our colossus on the floor. And when Adams finishes and the straw vote is taken, there are still 4 holdouts. Delaware. They have a 3-person delegation. 1 person's in favor, 1 is against, and the 3rd is homesick in Dover and hasn't been able to show up. South Carolina, which says we might be willing to change our vote to a yes in the interest of unanimity if other affirmative votes can be found. New York, which has not gotten its instructions from its state legislature, so they don't know how to vote, so they're not going to vote yes. And of course, Pennsylvania. So that night, back at the city tavern, back at the lodging houses, lots of horse trading going on, lots of wheeling and dealing, lots of argumentation. Someone rides down to Dover, Delaware to get Caesar Rodney out of bed, who's suffering from a grievous advanced case of facial cancer. Rodney gets on his horse and rides 50 miles by horseback through a terrible thunderstorm to show up even as Congress gavels itself into session on the morning of the 2nd. He's there in time to switch the Delaware's delegation to a yes to break the tie. New York still doesn't have instructions, but they say they will not vote no. They'll abstain. South Carolina said, well, in that interest, we will change our votes to a yes. And most notably, Pennsylvania becomes a yes. They had 3 people opposed, 2 in favor. One of those who was opposed, James Wilson, switches his vote to a yes. The other 2 noes, including John Dickinson, have conspicuously absented themselves from the vote. Dickinson cannot bring himself to vote against his conscience, but he understands the importance of unanimity, and he stays home so that his delegation can vote yes. And so there's a unanimous vote for independence on July 2nd. New York will get its instructions several days later, and they will amend the record so that they're yes eventually. Right? All that finagling, right? So then comes the declaration. All right, well, let's approve this document. So on the 3rd, they're going to debate this. And Jefferson sits in the corner, sullenly, silently, having his heart stabbed every time they strike a letter, strike a word, strike a sentence. But he won't get up and argue in favor of anything. Instead, it falls to Adams to serve as the lead champion for every word, every phrase, every sentence, every paragraph. And Adams argues vociferously in favor of these ideas that Jefferson has laid out. Congress will end up editing about a quarter of the document out, but it gets passed at the end of the day. They send it off to the printer to have it typed up, or written up, excuse me, and have its first official reading on the 4th of July, 1776. Adams says that I'm apt to believe that Independence Day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore.
Indeed.
Indeed. He got the spirit right, he got the date wrong. He actually wrote that to Abigail on July 3rd, referring to July 2nd. That's the date they agreed on independence, right? And who was the chief architect of that argument? But Jefferson wins history because we remember July 4th when the Declaration is read out loud, not when independence was approved. Why? Because even Adams knew that for all the power of oratory, it's ephemeral. It's gone. You're in the room to hear it now, and poof. Whereas Jefferson, one of his incredible superpowers is he tells you what you want to hear. Whether you realize it at the moment or not, as soon as you hear it, you're like, yeah, dude, yeah. And Adams knew this, and over their long career together, would become more and more infuriated by it. Because he knew Jefferson would win, because he's holding the pose. I'm going to inspire you. But, right? That's the Adams part. But Richard Stockton, who's one of those New Jersey delegates who came in late, he sums it up about it. He says, Adams it was who sustained the debate, and by the force of his reasoning demonstrated not only the justice, but the expediency of the measure. The man to whom the country is most indebted for the great measure of independence is John Adams. I call him the Atlas of American independence. Now this is that part of the evening I warned you about where I'm like, yeah, right, yeah. But the war's not done, because even as they're declaring the Declaration of Independence, British troops are landing on Staten Island. The Declaration of Independence means nothing unless there's some sort of military might to prove that we can hold on to what we have just declared. And so this is going to fall to George Washington. Adams and Washington have a long, complex relationship. But Adams shows nothing but loyalty to this man. He's the one, Adams is the one who nominated Washington to lead the Continental Army. After all, it would be helpful to have a Virginian at the head of this thing. Right? And when Washington goes and takes over that army, Adams then gets an inside look at how that works, because the day before he was nominated to head the Declaration Committee, he was put in charge of a brand new Board of War, which is essentially Congress's War Department. And Adams is the chair of that committee, in effect making him our first Secretary of War. He's the one responsible for making sure the Army gets paid and clothed and reinforced and supplied and organized, hailing promotions which he hates. And he understands, like, the colonies don't have to do anything. They have to be cajoled. It's cat herding. And that's one reason why Adams becomes a Federalist and thinks about the power of a strong federal government, a centralized force, because otherwise the colonies don't have to do anything. Right? That's why Washington becomes a Federalist as commander of the army. He realizes there needs to be a strong central control to manage things, because otherwise the army. The war itself is unmanageable. If we just leave it to the states to kind of help us out, pitch in for their goodwill, that didn't work. And Adams discovers that quickly. And he becomes pretty disillusioned with this whole notion of rah, 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 the people. Jefferson loves the people, and that's why the people love him. And Adams is like, the people can't be trusted. Maybe they mean well, but they will often act against their own interests. Don't see that, right? Okay? And that's why Adams becomes the politician he eventually becomes. That loyalty between Adams and Washington, you see it in this correspondence. Adams is nothing but publicly supportive of Washington, even though Washington is not necessarily his favorite general. And even to Abigail, he'll say like, I think our generals got out generals in New York, right? But to everybody else, he's like, Washington's the guy. We must support Washington. He's the guy. That support's probably best exemplified by an episode that happens early in Washington's presidency. John Adams is the vice president. He's overseeing the Senate, presiding over the Senate. And the Senate's debating, what should we call the new president? What should his title be? And by this point, Adams has spent years in Europe among the courts. He's used to the highfalutin language and the titles and the flourish, the pomp and circumstance. And so he thinks Washington should have a title similar to those veins because that's what the rules of diplomacy ask for. And so he proposes His High Exalted Majesty, the President of the United States and Protector of the rights of the citizens there. It's like that is an official title. And the Senate's like, are you kidding me? And Adams won't let the point go because he believes Washington is worthy of the dignity of the office. The Senate repays Adams by calling him his rotundity because he's Ironically, this sort of causes Washington to question Adams' judgment on things, and he does not bring Adams into the administration as vice president in a way that might have served them both well. Turns out they are almost perfectly in sync in their views, which they don't discover to the end of Washington's second term. Right? And Adams knows he's going to be in Washington's shadow forever. The whole world loves a military hero. Adams at one point says, oh, that I were a soldier. But he's not. And he knows he's not. And his talents are elsewhere. So he'll always be in Washington's shadow. And it doesn't bother him until later on in life when people start writing about the revolution and they're like, Washington was awesome! And Adams is like, and? And then there's no and. Like nobody, it's like, and so was John Adams, which is what he's wanting. And nobody does, and he gets super frustrated by it. So it's not so much that he's mad at Washington, but he really struggles with Washington's legacy. And he gets poked in the eye about it pretty badly by his own son, John Quincy Adams, who names his firstborn son George Washington Adams. Mom not happy. Abigail, she let John Quincy have it. John's not happy about it either. We don't have any record of him saying anything to John Quincy, but Abigail does. Their second son will be John Adams. And then finally, and this kind of brings us to our last figure, because as Adams is wrestling with this legacy of Washington, he says that finally the history of the Revolution is just going to be written such that Dr. Franklin takes his electric rod and smites the ground, and out springs Washington, and between the two of them, they conduct all the military, political, and diplomatic affairs of the Revolution. Nobody else. Franklin, as I said earlier, the most famous man in America. If you know anything about Franklin, it's because he wants you to know what you know. He is one of the most carefully curated, self-curated characters in American history. If you read the autobiography of Ben Franklin, it is one of the greatest works of American fiction ever. Okay? And he really worked hard to maintain a particular image as the old sage, inventing electricity with his kite flying out through the storm, wearing a coonskin hat and little spectacles, right? And this is what everybody thinks of, even today, when they think of Ben Franklin. That's what people thought of Ben Franklin then. And Adams has a chance to work with him in the Continental Congress. They serve on a peace negotiation together. And everything seems fine, but then Franklin gets sent to Europe to negotiate with the French to try to bring them into the war. And that delegation turns into a hot mess, and so Adams is sent over there to sort things out. He gets there and discovers that the paperwork's no one's keeping the books, everything's in disarray, the other agents hate each other, and Franklin is going to all these parties and sitting in the corner like this with a little grin on his face going, and not saying anything. And then when he does, it's in French that's so bad that all the ladies go, dee 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 cute. And then Adams discovers Franklin doesn't know French. And because they live together, and Adams gets to kind of spend time with Franklin as a person, not this curated image, he gets to look behind the curtain. It's no wonder the wizard says, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Because Ben Franklin is there in his skivvies, partying all the time, and being a man about town as a ladies' man. And Adams is aghast, and he's frustrated, he vomits. And it's worse because on a professional level, Franklin is conducting what's known as the diplomacy of deference. We will just let the French be nice to us when they feel like it. And Adams is like, no, we need money, we need troops, we need reinforcements, we need help with the British. And Franklin's like, well, yes, but it's impolite to ask, so let's just kind of like depend. And this becomes a huge philosophical difference that causes a lot of problems in the American delegation. Franklin will actually then connive, I use that word intentionally, connive to have Adams removed from office. Adams will then go to the Netherlands and negotiate a commercial treaty, which becomes super useful. And eventually, by 17, see, I knew I'd say this. Tom said, how hard is it as a Civil War guy to write the Revolutionary War? I said, wait till I say 18 something for the first time. So 1782, John Jay, a New Yorker, gets sent over to negotiate with the British for a peace treaty. Franklin and Adams are also supposed to be in that delegation. But Jay writes to Adams and says, you gotta get over here as fast as you can because Franklin's gonna give away the store to the French. So Adams rushes back to Paris and he and Jay negotiate directly with the British rather than taking the French advice. Turns out Franklin is on the same page. And so the three of them negotiate what becomes the Treaty of Paris. You see a picture up there. The British representatives didn't show up to have their their pictures painted because nobody wants to be remembered for being the ones who gave up the colonies, so they're not in the picture. Okay? But this relationship between Adams and Franklin just becomes so bitter that Adams will carry this grudge almost to his grave. Franklin passes judgment on Adams that tends to get passed down to history. He means well for his country. He's always an honest man, often a wise one. But sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. And that sticks with Adams. Adams, for his part, he refers to Franklin as the old conjurer, because he's putting up those illusions. That he was a great genius, a great wit, a great humorist, a great satirist, and a great politician is certain. That he was a great philosopher, a great moralist, a great statesman is more questionable. He was a man of very moderate abilities, but also one of the most curious characters in history. After the treaty is negotiated, Adams is named Minister of the Court of St. James, where he goes to see George III, who actually welcomes and compliments him. They have a very cordial relationship. Adams considers it one of the greatest compliments of his life that George is kind to. He'll get elected as our first vice president, serving under Washington for 8 years. He'll serve 4 years as president himself. But those years of the 1790s are so politically contentious that Adams is voted out of office in favor of Jefferson. If you think we are politically divided today, go read a newspaper from the 1790s. Then Adams goes through what I refer to his old, bitter, grumpy old man years, where he's just upset that he got voted out of office and Jefferson is winning history. Jefferson, who does not believe in a strong executive, decides, oh, I'm going to buy Louisiana Purchase. You know, like, what? That's not what that, you know. He eventually will reconcile with Jefferson in 1818. Excuse me, 1812. And they begin a correspondence, and at first it's just kind of feeling out the waters, like, hey, how you been? Hey, glad to hear from you, love you. I never had any hard feelings, me neither, you know. And it's a very cautious rapprochement. But eventually, John says, we should not die until we've had the chance to explain ourselves to each other. And they begin writing not only to each other, but to history, to us. And they lay out their competing visions of what the revolution meant. What did independence mean? What did liberty mean? And they're the same arguments we're still having today. And I think we forget the genius of the founders is that they institutionalized that discussion so that the system itself is about the discussion. That's the point. The one time we gave up on talking to each other ended up with a civil war, which should serve as a good reminder why we should not give up on the discussion. It is the point. And we can go back and read the letters that these two men write to each other and see these competing, contradictory, complementary visions of what America should be. And it's all there for us if we take the time to read it. And it is brilliant reading. And in the middle of it, like John Adams is bragging about his manure piles. You know, I mean, so it's still very human too. Right? And they carry on this correspondence literally until the day they died, which was the same day. And it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. And this is, again, one of those things, if I was a novelist and I wrote this, you would not believe the coincidence, right? And they're both kind of in their older years, and they know that, you know, time's winding down. Jefferson has kind of this ongoing declining health issue. John's collapse is pretty, relatively sudden. But they know that the 4th of July is coming. They've both been asked to write something for their local celebrations. Adams says, independence forever. The committee says, do you want to add to that? He says, not one word. Independence forever. What a beautiful promise, but also a responsibility inherent in that. On the 3rd of July, Jefferson is bedridden. He's fading in and out of consciousness, a little bit delirium. If you've ever been to his house in Monticello, you'll see his bed is like in an alcove right next to his study. And on the far side of his study, he had a bust of John Adams. And on the morning of the 4th, Jefferson wakes up just enough to ask his granddaughter, is it the 4th yet? He's very conscious of timing. And those were his last words. He'll pass away in the middle of the morning, July 4th, 1776. See, 1826, with his old friend across the room, looking at him as he takes his last breath. That afternoon, John rouses himself enough to look at his family gathered around his bedside. And his last words, Jefferson survives. He doesn't know that his friend passed away hours earlier. And yet his words remain true today because he knew that Jefferson would win history. And on his deathbed, he seemed to reconcile with that thought. And his last thoughts are those of his friend and the vision that he has laid forward before us. And what Jefferson perhaps might have meant by independence for them. So I hope after tonight, your butts aren't too asleep. I would encourage you to go back and read the letters that John and Tom wrote to each other. Go back and read the letters that John and Abigail wrote to each other. Go back and read the letters John wrote to John Quincy, who of course goes on to become president. And his father saying, don't make the same mistakes I did. It's all there, and we have the opportunity to become reacquainted with these incredible figures who have much to teach us and can remind us just how vibrant our discussions and our squabbles are today, because they were having them 250 years ago. And it's all there for us to discover for ourselves. I think that you will find them all very good company. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I kept it a long time. Dick?
Well, first of all, congratulations to you. That was a very important and compelling presentation.
Here, here.
But in the discussion of the Federalists versus the Republic, I believe it was Madison who wrote in paper number 635. And I may have
Don't quiz me on that one.
okay. Federal Paper 65. And as an advocate for the Federalists, he wrote these words, which I think are prescient. Were it not for the nature of man, you would not need a strong central government.
Certainly, and that's one reason why Adams himself writes in the Massachusetts Constitution that we should be a nation of laws, not of men. You know, the idea that structure can then tame human nature, because human nature is not reliable. And Jefferson and Madison himself later on really believed in the wisdom of the people. And Adams, like, who had seen tarring and feathering in Boston? Like, the mob cannot be trusted, right? And so that's where that tension comes from, and why they believe these structures were necessary for taming human nature and channeling it in ways that then would allow people to overcome their emotions so that they could act in their own best interests. Absolutely. Carl, you have a question?
Well, John did get some solace in going into Congress, correct?
John Quincy.
Quincy?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's his son, John Quincy, just as Carl's mentioning. So when John Quincy is president, he gets to serve one term, gets ousted by the Jacksonians, goes back to Massachusetts for a while, where his community in Quincy elects him to Congress. And then he'll go and serve in Congress for almost 30 years. He's the only former president to then go on to elected office. And I love John Quincy's career, because then he spends the next 30 years poking pro-slavery people in the eye. And there's a gag rule that prevents discussion of slavery, and he goes around that. He finds every part of it. Oh, it's wonderful. And he kind of carries on this very abolitionist-centric mission, and he just pokes slaveholders in the eye every chance he gets.
I didn't realize he was so long in the beginning.
Yeah.
Old man eloquent.
Old man eloquent, yeah. He ends up dying on the floor of the House during debate, and they take him into the Speaker's chamber. Thank you all for coming out.